Hedonism is the view that these two principles are true. The pleasure principle, which states that pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically and naturally valuable to human beings, and the pain principle, which states that pain is the only thing that is intrinsically and naturally disvaluable to human beings. What is meant by intrinsically valuable is that it is valued for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. And what is meant by intrinsically disvaluable is that it is disvalued or avoided for its own intrinsic quality, not for anything else. What is meant by naturally valuable is that it is valuable for us by virtue of how we have universally evolved or have been designed as human beings. And what is meant by naturally disvaluable is that it is disvalued by us by virtue of how we naturally evolved or were naturally designed. While the experience of honor or the standards of beauty may differ across cultures and traditions, one's experience of pleasure and pain is universally the same. These two principles therefore have intuitive appeal because of how human beings have evolved. As to the pleasure principle, we have pleasure centers in our brain which make us naturally attracted to pleasures. By virtue of our bodily design, we are naturally predisposed to seek pleasure of all kinds. With regards to pain principle, we have pain receptors throughout our body which signals us when we are in pain. And by virtue of our evolutionary desire to survive, and since pain serves as a signal that there is a threat to our current well-being, we are naturally predisposed to avoid pain. For a hedonist, what is morally right is whatever produces pleasure, and what is morally wrong is whatever produces pain. The goal of morality then is to achieve a life with the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. The first proponents of hedonism are the Cyrenaics, named after the birthplace of their founder Aristippus of Cyrene. If one agrees with the pleasure and pain principle, one would naturally ask what kind of life would produce the greatest pleasures and the least amount of pain. For the Cyrenaics, the best life is the one that produces the most bodily pleasure: food, drink, music, sex, and the like. While it may be uncontroversial that a life with the most bodily pleasure seems a good life, all else being equal, it is not clear how it is a morally good life. One of the major charges to hedonism is that it is a sort of vulgar sensualism, which is a life that, having comprised solely of bodily pleasures, seems worthy only of a swine. A life merely of seeking and experiencing pleasures of all sorts seems inappropriate for human beings. And in order to highlight the problematic nature of hedonism as one of vulgar sensualism, let us turn to Soren Kierkegaard's idea of the three stages of human existence. The first stage is what he calls the aesthetic life, which for our purposes may also be called the hedonistic life, because it is governed with what Kierkegaard calls the immediate, which refers to the natural, spontaneous sensations that lie at the heart of conscious human existence. The best example of an aesthete, that is, a person living the aesthetic life, is the young child. For any child, life is about living in the moment, which is dominated by satisfying immediate desires. The second stage is what Kierkegaard calls the ethical life, which arises out of the shallowness and transitory nature of the aesthetic life. The differentiating factor for these two stages is the search for a coherent sense of self. Since the aesthetic life is reduced to a collection of pleasurable moments, the aesthete lacks a coherent sense of self. The ethical life is a struggle to become a unified self in two senses: a self that has coherence and not merely a collection of transitory pleasures, and a self that has endurance, which means that the coherent self continues to exist over time. And in order to be a self, one must know oneself, and to know oneself, one must have something to live for, commitments and values that permit all one does and is, and that do not change on a daily or hourly basis. By these two stages alone, we can see the severe lack of depth in the life of a hedonist. By comparing the two stages, most will likely agree that the ethical life is a better life than the aesthetic life. In fact, the ethical person, understood here to mean one that is in the ethical stage, is a mature person compared to the aesthete. Bear in mind that the example given in the aesthete stage is the young child, while we may give as example in the ethical stage is the responsible adult. While the aesthete and hedonist are dictated by their immediate desires and the seeking of pleasures, the responsible adult is able to practice delayed gratification for the sake of his commitments and values. Delayed gratification is the act of choosing to forego one's immediate desires for the sake of achieving something perceived to be of greater value, such as protecting one's family, helping one's friends, or achieving long-term success in the future. It seems then that the objection that hedonism is a form of vulgar sensualism appears to hold.